Welcome to the Sleeping Archive, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it.
Carries the scent of wild thyme through these ancient oaks, as it did on quieter days before the world broke open. And I wonder if God still listens to the prayers whispered beneath their branches. My name is Father Étienne Morel, and I have been dead to the world for 3 years now. Not in body, you understand, but in spirit, dead to the parish that once knew me, dead to the altar where I once broke bread, dead to the community that once gathered in my small stone church every Sunday morning. I speak these words to no one but the trees, for there is no one left to hear them. The living have either fled or been silenced, and the dead, the dead are so numerous now that I sometimes wonder if I am not among them after all. But my hands still shake with cold, my stomach still gnaws with hunger, and my heart still breaks anew each morning when I remember what we have lost. It was the spring of 1791, when the troubles began in earnest, though the seeds had been planted long before. I had served the parish of Saint-Michel-de-la-Roche for 27 years, watching children grow into parents, blessing marriages, comforting the dying. My church was small, barely large enough for the 150 souls who called our village home, but it was the heart of our community. The bell tower, built by the grandfather of old Thomas the blacksmith, could be heard from every cottage and farm within 3 miles. Those were gentle days, when my greatest concerns were whether young Marie Dubois would finally accept the courtship of the baker's son, or if the widow Bretagne would remember to bring her famous honey cakes to the harvest festival. I kept a small garden behind the rectory, where I grew vegetables for the poor families, and on warm evenings I would sit on my wooden bench, reading my breviary while the swallows danced overhead. The news from Paris reached us slowly, like ripples from a stone thrown into a distant pond. At first, we heard only whispers from the traveling merchants, talk of meetings and assemblies, of grievances against the king. Politics, said Thomas, hammering his iron with particular vigor. What concern is it of ours? We have our work, our families, our faith. Let the gentlemen in their fine coats argue about taxes. But the ripples grew stronger. In the summer of 1790, Citizen Moreau arrived from the district capital with papers and proclamations. He was a thin man with intense eyes and ink-stained fingers, who spoke of a civil constitution of the clergy, with the fervor I usually reserved for Easter sermons. The church, he explained, was to be reorganized. Priests would be elected by the people and paid by the state. We would swear loyalty to the new constitution before God and nation. This is progress, Father, he said, unrolling his documents on my kitchen table. The church will be purified, freed from the corruption of Rome. You will serve your people better than ever before. I offered him tea, good tea, the kind my sister sent from Nantes, and listened carefully. The changes seemed reasonable enough on paper. Elections instead of appointments by distant bishops. Salaries that would ensure priests need not depend on tithes from families who could barely feed themselves. A church that served France above all else. And those who refuse? I asked, stirring honey into my cup. Citizen Moreau's smile faltered slightly. Why would anyone refuse? This is the will of the people, blessed by the National Assembly. It is the law. That night, I walked through my village in the gathering dusk. I knew every window that glowed with candlelight, every garden gate, every stone in the church wall. Marie Dubois waved from her doorway, and I blessed her with the sign of the cross. The widow Bretagne called out to ask about Sunday sermon, her voice warm despite the creak in her knees and the ache she never mentioned. 3 children ran past, chasing a cat that had stolen their bowl of yarn. How could I explain to them that their gentle priest, who once worried over harvest festivals and honey cakes, now faced an impossible choice? To swear the oath meant accepting that the church could be remade by political decree, that the authority of Rome and tradition meant less than the will of a distant assembly. To refuse meant what? Exile? Imprisonment? I had heard rumors from other districts of priests who had vanished in the night. I knelt before the altar that night, staring up at the wooden crucifix that had watched over our prayers for 3 generations. The carved Christ looked down with the same expression of patient suffering he had always worn. But his silence felt different now, not peaceful, but ominous. "Lord," I whispered, "show me the path. I am only a simple priest. I tend my flock as best I can. What am I to do when the shepherds are commanded to choose between you and the state?" The only answer was the whisper of wind through the church's old stones, and the distant sound of Thomas's dog barking at shadows. When Citizen Moreau returned the following week with local officials and a crowd of curious villagers, I stood before them in my best cassock and spoke the words that would seal our fate. I cannot, in good conscience, swear an oath that places the authority of men above the authority of God. I serve Christ first, and through him all souls entrusted to my care. The crowd murmured, some in approval, others in confusion. Citizen Moreau's face darkened. "Then you are no priest of France, but an enemy of the people. You have until sunset to reconsider." Old Thomas stepped forward, his blacksmith's arms crossed. "Father Morel has served us well for 27 years. He baptized my children, buried my wife, blessed my harvests. Who are you to tell us who may tend our souls?" "I am a representative of the lawful government," Moreau replied sharply, "and this man has just declared himself in rebellion against it." That was the moment, I think, when the war truly began in our small corner of the world, not with armies or cannon, but with a simple question of loyalty that split families and communities like an axe splitting wood. Some villagers supported me, the older ones mostly, and those whose faith ran deeper than their politics. Others, particularly the younger men who had embraced the revolutionary fervor, sided with Moreau. By evening, nearly half the village had gathered in the square, arguing in voices that grew louder and more bitter as the sun set. I watched from my rectory window as neighbors who had shared communion wine just days before now faced each other with clenched fists and hard eyes. "This is what comes of your stubbornness," called out Jean Lacoste, whose daughter I had confirmed just the previous spring. "You would divide us all for the sake of your pride." "It is not pride," replied the widow Bretagne, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "It is faith, something your generation seems to have forgotten." The argument might have continued all night, but Citizen Moreau fired a pistol into the air. "Enough! The priest has until dawn to take the oath or face the consequences. The law will be obeyed." I spent that night in prayer, but also in preparation. I gathered what few belongings I could carry, my breviary, a change of clothes, the silver chalice my mother had given me at ordination. Before dawn, I celebrated what I knew would be my last Mass in the church of Saint-Michel de la Roche. Perhaps 30 souls attended, the faithful few who would risk association with a refractory priest. We sang the old hymns in whispers, and when I raised the host, I felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon us. This ritual, once the heartbeat of our Sundays, was now an act of rebellion. "Go in peace," I told them, as the first light of dawn filtered through the stained glass windows. "Remember that Christ's love endures beyond the reach of any earthly authority." But even as I spoke those words, I could hear the sound of marching feet approaching through the village square. The forest became my cathedral, the trees my vaulted ceiling, and the faithful my wandering congregation. For 2 years I lived like a man pursued, which indeed I was. The new constitutional priest, Father Garnier, had taken residence in my rectory within a week of my departure. He was a young man, sincere enough in his way, but the older parishioners would have nothing to do with him. "He may wear the vestments," whispered Marie Dubois when she found me at the old hermit's cave 2 miles into the woods, "but he is not our priest. You are." This became the pattern of my new existence. By day, I remained hidden in caves, abandoned barns, or the deep forest, where even the most zealous citizen soldiers rarely ventured. By night, I moved like a ghost through the countryside, celebrating secret masses in farmhouse kitchens, performing baptisms by moonlight beside hidden streams, and hearing confessions whispered beneath the stars. We called them sacraments. The state called them sedition. The network that supported me was more extensive than I had dared hope. The Widow Bretagne coordinated safe houses, using her weekly trips to market as cover for carrying messages between scattered communities of the faithful. Thomas the blacksmith crafted hiding places in barns and root cellars, his skill with iron proving as valuable for concealing priests as for shoeing horses. Even some who had publicly accepted the constitutional church privately sought me out for the real sacraments. "Forgive me, Father," said Jean Lacoste one October night, kneeling before me in his own barn while rain drummed on the roof. "I spoke against you in the square, but I cannot sleep. My conscience tortures me. I want my new son baptized properly, by you, not by that puppet in the rectory." Such moments filled me with both joy and sorrow, joy that faith persisted despite persecution, sorrow that simple devotion had become an act requiring such courage. But the authorities were not idle. Citizen Moreau had been replaced by a more zealous official named Fouquet, a man who saw refractory priests as enemies of the people worthy of any punishment. Search parties combed the countryside with increasing frequency. Rewards were offered for information leading to my capture. Some villagers, whether from genuine revolutionary fervor or simple greed, became informants. It was young Philippe Garnier, no relation to the constitutional priest, who nearly undid us all. The boy was barely 18, filled with revolutionary ideals and eager to prove his patriotism. When he spotted me emerging from the Widow Bretagne's barn one November morning, he ran straight to the authorities. "The traitor priest is hiding with the widow," he shouted in the square. "I saw him with my own eyes." Within an hour, a squad of National Guards surrounded the Bretagne farm. They found my breviary hidden beneath the floor, my spare cassock rolled inside a grain sack. The Widow Bretagne, 73 years old and arthritic, was arrested on charges of harboring an enemy of the state. I watched from the tree line as they led her away, her gray head held high despite the jeers of the crowd that had gathered. She caught sight of me through the branches and shook her head slightly, a warning not to attempt rescue. That was the last time I saw her alive. The news of her fate reached me 3 weeks later through Marie Dubois, whose eyes were red with weeping. "They sent her to Nantes," she whispered as we knelt together in the ruins of an abandoned chapel. "To the tribunal. She was condemned for supporting the enemies of the Republic." I knew what that meant. The revolutionary tribunals in the cities had become instruments of terror, sending hundreds to the guillotine each week. To be condemned for supporting refractory priests was a death sentence. "She died blessing them," Marie continued, her voice barely audible. "The guard who brought the news said she forgave her executioners and prayed for France with her final breath. That night, alone in my cave with only the wind for company, I wept as I had not wept since childhood. The crackdown intensified after the Widow Bretagne's arrest. Searches became more frequent and thorough. Neighbors were encouraged to report suspicious activity. The network of safe houses began to collapse as fear overcame devotion. By the spring of 1793, I was reduced to celebrating Mass perhaps once or twice a month in locations that changed constantly. My congregation had dwindled from the hundreds who once filled my church to a handful of the most devoted and most desperate. What had once been rites of comfort were now secret rites of defiance. It was during this period that the violence truly began. News reached us that the king had been executed in January, and the moderates who had initially led the revolution were themselves being consumed by their more radical successors. The word Vendée began to appear in the reports from Paris, our region singled out as a hotbed of counter-revolution that must be crushed. They are calling us brigands and fanatics, reported Thomas during one of our clandestine meetings. The newspapers from Paris say we are in league with foreign enemies, that we wish to restore the old tyranny. And what do we wish, Thomas? I asked. Tell me truly. The old blacksmith was quiet for a long moment, staring at his calloused hands. We wish to worship as our fathers did, to keep our priests, to live in peace. If that makes us brigands, then I suppose we are brigands. But peace was no longer possible. The constitutional priest, Father Garnier, had been replaced by a more militant cleric who preached that refractory priests were not merely mistaken, but actively evil. Citizens were encouraged to view us as agents of foreign powers, enemies of French liberty who deserved no mercy. The transformation of my former parish was heartbreaking to witness. As dawn broke over the countryside, where I had been born and hoped to die in peace, I could see smoke rising from the direction of my village. The war had finally come to Saint-Michel-de-la-Roche. The first time I saw men kill in the name of God, I was hidden in a haystack, watching through gaps between the bundled grain. It was early March of 1794, and the winter had been cruel to all of us, rebels and Republicans alike. The constitutional priest, poor Father Garnier, was saying Mass in my old church when the White Army descended upon the village like a spring flood. They were not the professional soldiers I had expected, but farmers and craftsmen transformed by desperation into warriors. I recognized faces among them, boys I had confirmed, men whose children I had baptized. They carried crude weapons, hunting rifles, farm tools sharpened into pikes, knives better suited to butchering pigs than men. Their leader was someone I had known since childhood, Henri Dubois, Marie's elder brother, whose beard had gone gray during our months of hiding. For God and King, they shouted as they burst through the church doors. The constitutional priest, barely 25 years old and terrified, fell to his knees before the altar, clutching his breviary like a shield. Please, he whispered, I am a priest. I serve God as you do. Henri's face was stone. You serve the devil who has stolen our churches and murdered our true priests. There is no mercy for apostates. What followed haunts me still. The young priest's blood stained the altar where I had consecrated bread and wine for 27 years. His final cry, Jesus, forgive them, echoed off the stones that had heard so many prayers, but his killers showed no remorse. They dragged his body outside and displayed it in the square as a warning to all who served the constitutional church. I remained hidden as the White Army occupied the village for 3 days, liberating it, they claimed, from Republican tyranny. They celebrated Mass in the church, my Mass, with my old vestments that they had somehow preserved. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the world I had lost might be restored. But the restoration came at a price written in blood. Every family suspected of Republican sympathies was driven from their homes. The baker who had accepted the constitutional church was beaten so severely that he died 2 days later. His crime? Selling bread to National Guard officers. Young Philippe Garnier, the boy who had betrayed the widow Bretagne, was found hanging from the oak tree in the square, a placard around his neck reading, Traitor to Faith and King. This is not the path of Christ, I told Henri. when he found me in my hiding place and begged me to return to the church. This violence, this hatred, it corrupts the very faith we claim to defend. But the White Army's triumph was short-lived. Within a week, Republican forces arrived in overwhelming numbers. General Turreau, the man they called the Hammer of the Vendée, had been given carte blanche to pacify the region by any means necessary. His soldiers were different from the local National Guards we had faced before, hardened veterans from the wars on France's borders, men who saw us not as misguided citizens, but as enemies to be exterminated. The reconquest of Saint-Michel-de-la-Roche was swift and merciless. The white soldiers, outnumbered 10 to 1, melted back into the countryside, but the villagers who had welcomed them paid the price. Houses were burned, livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned. The church itself was used as a stable for the Republican cavalry, its sacred vessels melted down for bullets. I watched it all from the forest, powerless to intervene. Marie Dubois was among those executed, shot against the church wall for the crime of embracing her brother when he briefly returned home. Thomas the blacksmith survived only because he proved useful to the occupying forces, but he was a broken man, his spirit crushed by what he had witnessed. They are systematically destroying not just the rebellion, but the very possibility of rebellion, he told me during a chance encounter in the woods. His hair had gone completely white, and his hands shook constantly now. They kill not just fighters, but their families, their neighbors, anyone who ever showed them kindness. They would make a desert and call it peace. The strategy was working. Village after village fell to the Republican columns, their populations scattered or destroyed. The countryside that had once supported networks of hidden priests and secret masses was now a wasteland patrolled by soldiers who shot anyone found away from authorized settlements. By the summer of 1794, the great rebellion of the Vendée was essentially crushed. The white armies that had once threatened to march on Paris were reduced to scattered bands of survivors, hiding in the deep forests and salt marshes. The population of entire districts had been decimated. Some villages were simply empty, their inhabitants dead, fled, or transported to other regions as punishment for their disloyalty. I had become a ghost haunting a graveyard. The network of faithful who had once sustained me was shattered. The churches were empty or destroyed. The very landscape seemed scarred by violence, with burned farmhouses and neglected fields bearing witness to what we had lost. Yet still I continued my ministry, celebrating Mass for congregations of 2 or 3 survivors, baptizing children born in caves and forests, administering last rites to rebels who died far from home. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to fall like tears from heaven, I faced a bitter truth. I was no longer a shepherd tending his flock, but the last mourner at a funeral that would never end. The winter of 1794 brought a silence deeper than any I had ever known, not merely the absence of sound, but the absence of purpose, of hope, of the very rhythms that had given meaning to my life. For months now, I had not celebrated a single Mass, baptized a single child, or heard a single confession. The faithful were dead, scattered, or too frightened to seek out a priest whose very existence had become a capital crime. I had taken shelter in a cave system deep in the forest, a natural cathedral of limestone that had never heard human prayers until I began whispering the divine office to its walls. The acoustics were strange there. My voice seemed to echo back changed, as if the stone itself were questioning the words I spoke. I found myself pausing mid-psalm, not because I forgot the words, but because I no longer knew if I believed them. It was in this cave that I met Father Antoine Rousseau, another refractory priest who had been driven from his parish near La Rochelle. He arrived half dead from cold and hunger, guided to my hiding place by rumors that had somehow survived when everything else had perished. Antoine was younger than I, perhaps 45, but the war had aged him terribly. His hair was completely grey, his hands bore the scars of manual labor, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had seen too much. We were like two survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the same piece of driftwood in an endless sea. Father Morel, he said, when he had recovered enough to speak coherently, I have been searching for you for months. They say you are the last priest still active in this region. Active? I laughed, a sound devoid of humor. I have not said Mass in 6 weeks. I have not seen one of the faithful in longer than that. If this is activity, then I am the busiest man in France. But Antoine's arrival brought unexpected news from the wider world. The terror was ending, he reported. Robespierre and his allies were dead, executed by the very machinery of death they had created. A new government, the Directory, was attempting to restore some measure of moderation to the revolutionary chaos. There is talk, he said hopefully, of reconciliation. Some constitutional priests have been allowed to return to their parishes. There are rumors that non-juring clergy might be granted amnesty if they agree to certain accommodations. What manner of accommodations? Antoine's face grew troubled. A simple oath of loyalty to the Republic, not to the civil constitution, but to the government itself. Many of our brother priests believe it is acceptable, a political oath, not a religious one. We debated this question through the long winter nights. Was it possible to serve God while acknowledging the authority of a government that had persecuted the Church? Could we make such an oath in good conscience, viewing it as merely a practical necessity for resuming our ministry? Or was any accommodation with the revolutionary regime a betrayal of those who had died rather than compromise their faith? Think of what we could accomplish, Antoine argued. Churches reopened, sacraments restored, the faithful gathered once again. Surely God would forgive a formula of words if it allowed us to resume his work. And what of the widow Bretagne? I replied. What of Marie Dubois, of all those who died rather than accept such compromises? Do we make their sacrifice meaningless by doing now what they refused to do then? If words are only wind, then why did so many die refusing to utter them? It was during these discussions that we learned of developments that made our theological debates suddenly urgent. A messenger, young Paul Moreau, whose father had been among the first revolutionary officials in our region, brought word that the new government was indeed offering terms to refractory priests. He also delivered a scrap of linen, smuggled by a child whose mother had once been a member of my congregation. In faded ink, the message read, "My daughter is dying. Will no priest come?" The offer was straightforward, an oath of submission and loyalty to the laws of the Republic, along with a promise not to engage in activities hostile to the government. In return, we would be allowed to resume our ministry, though under the oversight of civil authorities. That night, alone with my thoughts in the cave's depths, I faced the most difficult decision of my life. Not the simple choice between oath and exile that had faced me years earlier, but something more complex, the question of whether faithfulness sometimes required accepting the possible rather than demanding the ideal. Spring came early that year, and with it a decision I could no longer delay. Antoine had chosen to accept the government's offer and prepared to leave for the district capital to take the required oath. Before departing, he made one final appeal. "Come with me, Father," he urged. "We can rebuild the church together. We can heal the wounds, restore the community, bring comfort to those who have suffered so much." I walked with him to the edge of our forest sanctuary, where a path led back toward the world of men and politics and compromise. For a moment, I wavered. The temptation was real, to return to a normal life, to sleep in a real bed, to celebrate Mass in a real church, to matter again in the world. I cannot, I said finally. Not because I judge you for your choice, but because I cannot separate my faith from my conscience. To take that oath would kill something in me that I cannot afford to lose. Antoine embraced me, tears in his eyes. Then I fear this is goodbye, my friend. I do not think we will meet again in this world. 6 months later, I learned that he had indeed resumed his ministry, reopening a church near Tours and serving a congregation grateful for any priest, constitutional or refractory. He died of pneumonia the following winter, worn out by his efforts to rebuild what had been destroyed. I knew only that his path and mine had diverged, and that I was now more alone than ever, not just physically isolated, but spiritually cut off from even my fellow priests who had chosen accommodation over continued resistance. Napoleon has been emperor for more than a year now, and France has found a new kind of peace. The reports that reach me speak of prosperity returning, of churches reopening under the concordat he signed with the Pope, of former enemies reconciling in the name of national unity. The revolution that once threatened to consume everything has been tamed, channeled into imperial ambitions that stretch across Europe. Yet here I remain in my forest sanctuary, an anachronism from a time most prefer to forget. I am 68 years old now, my hair white as winter snow, my hands gnarled from years of living rough. The cave that has been my home for so long feels smaller each year, as if the weight of memory itself were pressing down upon the limestone walls. Occasionally, travelers pass through these woods, merchants, pilgrims, young men seeking adventure in Napoleon's armies. Sometimes they stop to share a meal or ask directions, and I listen to their stories of the wider world. France is strong again, they tell me. The chaos of revolution has given way to order and glory. The church functions once more, its priests properly trained and appointed, its rituals restored to their proper place in society. You could return, you know, said a young priest who discovered my retreat last spring. Father Beaumont was his name, barely 30 years old, ordained under the new arrangements between church and state. The emperor has granted amnesty to all former refractory clergy. You could have a parish again, a proper church, a real congregation. I offered him what food I had, wild mushrooms and herbs, bread baked on a stone over my fire, and listened as he described his own ministry. He served 3 villages now, riding between them on Sundays to celebrate Mass for communities still rebuilding from the war years. The work was hard but rewarding, he said. People were hungry for spiritual guidance after so many years of upheaval. And what do you tell them? I asked. How do you address their questions about what they witnessed, what they suffered? Father Beaumont paused, considering his words carefully. I tell them that the past is past, that we must focus on rebuilding, on healing, on moving forward together. There's no benefit in dwelling on old wounds or reopening old conflicts. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the living did need to move forward, to build new communities on the foundations of the old. Perhaps my insistence on remembering, on bearing witness, was simply the stubbornness of an old man who could not accept that his time had passed. Yet I could not shake the feeling that something essential was being lost in this rush toward reconciliation. The widow Britannia's courage, Marie Dubois' faithfulness, the young constitutional priest's final cry for forgiveness, were these just embarrassing memories to be politely forgotten? Did the price they paid for their convictions mean nothing to the new generation that inherited the peace their sacrifice had helped to purchase? After Father Beaumont left, I spent weeks pondering these questions. I read and reread the letters that had been smuggled to me over the years, messages from the scattered faithful, reports of deaths and births, fragments of news from the wider world. Each piece of correspondence was a thread in the tapestry of memory I had been unconsciously weaving throughout my exile. One evening, as autumn painted the forest in shades of gold and crimson, I was visited by a ghost from my past. Thomas the blacksmith, now well into his 70s, climbed the steep path to my cave with the careful steps of a man whose joints had felt too many winters. "Father," he said, settling himself on the stone where I usually sat to write, "I have come to make my confession." I had not heard those words in years. The formal sacrament of confession had been one of the casualties of my isolation. Without a proper congregation seeking spiritual guidance, I had almost forgotten this most intimate aspect of priestly ministry. His confession was simple and devastating. He admitted that, during the persecution, he almost betrayed me to save his son. Tears streamed down his face as he confessed the torment of having once weighed my life against his child's safety. I placed my hand on his bowed head, feeling the familiar weight of spiritual authority I had not exercised in so long. "Thomas, my friend, you chose as any father would choose. The sin was not in your heart, but in the circumstances that put you in such a position." We prayed together as the sun set behind the trees, two old men seeking peace in a world that had moved beyond their understanding. He said the world wanted to forget. I told him memory is the quietest kind of resistance. After Thomas left, I examined the gifts he had brought: proper ink, good paper, a decent pen, and I began the most important work of my life. Not the chronicle of events I had been composing, but a series of letters to the future. Letters to the children who would grow up in Napoleon's France, to the grandchildren who would inherit the world we had unknowingly created through our choices and sacrifices. Most importantly, I wrote to warn them that such times might come again, that the choice between conscience and convenience, between faith and expediency, between loyalty to ideals and accommodation to power, was a choice each generation must make anew. The year is 1810, and I am dying. Not dramatically, not from persecution or violence, but simply from the accumulated weight of 73 years, 17 of them spent in exile from the world of men. My body, sustained for so long by berries and herbs and the occasional kindness of strangers, has finally begun the slow process of returning to the earth that has sheltered me. The wind still carries wild thyme through the trees, but it no longer smells of spring, only memory. I write these final words by the light of a candle that will not last the night, surrounded by the pages that have become my life's work. Hundreds of sheets covered with stories, memories, testimonies, the last will and testament of a France that died in the revolutionary years and was buried beneath the glories of the empire. Yesterday, I received what I suspect will be my final visitor. She came climbing the forest path with the sure steps of youth, though she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had known sorrow. When she reached my cave, she knelt before me with the reverence I had not seen since my days in the pulpit. "Father Morel," she said, "I am Claire Dubois, granddaughter of Marie. I have come to ask for your blessing." Claire was perhaps 25 years old, with her grandmother's gentle eyes and determined chin. She wore the simple dress of a working woman, but carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to lead others through difficult times. "My grandmother spoke of you often before she died," Claire continued. "She said you were the keeper of our stories, the one who remembered what we had lost and why it mattered." "And what do you remember, child?" I asked. "What stories have been passed down to your generation?" Claire was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I remember that my grandmother died for her faith, that she chose to protect you rather than save herself, that she believed some things were worth more than life itself." "And do you believe that?" "I want to," she said honestly, "but it's hard to understand. living in this new world. The emperor has made peace with the church. Priests serve openly again. The persecution is over. Sometimes I wonder if my grandmother's sacrifice was necessary or if she simply died for nothing. Her honesty moved me. Here was a young woman wrestling with the same questions that had haunted me for years: whether faithfulness to principle was worth the price it demanded, whether the martyrs of our time had died for eternal truths or temporal misunderstandings. I placed my trembling hands on her bowed head, feeling the weight of 3 generations of faith and doubt and love. Claire, daughter of Marie, granddaughter of martyrs, you have something your grandmother never had: the freedom to choose your own path. That freedom was purchased with her blood, and with the blood of countless others who refused to compromise their consciences. But how do I honor that sacrifice? How do I live a life worthy of their memory? By remembering, I said, by bearing witness, by ensuring that the stories are not lost. Your grandmother did not die so that you could live exactly as she did. She died so that you could live according to your own conscience, informed by her example, but not imprisoned by it. We talked through the night, this young woman and I, about faith and doubt, about memory and forgiveness, about the eternal human struggle to balance loyalty to the past with hope for the future. As dawn broke over the forest, she prepared to leave, but not before making a promise that filled my heart with unexpected peace. I will preserve your writings, Father. I will copy them, share them, ensure they reach those who need to hear these stories. Your witness will not be lost. After she left, I sat in the entrance to my cave, watching the sun rise over the countryside I had served so long ago. Somewhere beyond the forest, church bells were ringing, not the familiar bronze voice of my old church, which had been melted down for cannon during the war, but new bells calling new congregations to new forms of worship. I thought of all those who had shaped my understanding of faith and faithfulness: the widow Bretagne, Marie Dubois, Thomas the blacksmith, Henri Dubois. Each of them had faced the central question of our time in their own way. How do we remain faithful to our deepest beliefs while living in a world that no longer shares or supports those beliefs? As for me, I had chosen the path of witness. I had remained in the wilderness not from inability to adapt, but from a sense that someone needed to remember, to preserve, to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Whether this was wisdom or stubbornness, faithfulness or pride, I leave to others to judge. The candle is burning low now, and my hand grows unsteady. Soon I will join the communion of saints, or perhaps simply return to the earth that has been my home for so long. Either way, my work is finished. The stories have been told, the memories preserved, the witness borne. Into your hands, O Lord, I commend the memory entrusted to me.
You've been listening to The Sleeping Archive. Sleep well. History will wait.